The small town of Ashfield, Virginia, seemed to thrive on its air of quiet respectability. Lined with orderly streets and crowned by a proud courthouse, it was a community where everyone knew everyone, or so they believed. Beneath the surface, shadows often gathered where no one dared to look. 16-year-old Emily Carter had grown up in the echo of loss. Her father, a soldier, had died overseas, leaving her and her mother, Ruth, to navigate life in his absence. Ruth worked tirelessly at the local diner, scraping together enough to provide for Emily and keep their modest home intact. For Emily, the weight of her father's sacrifice often felt like an invisible tether, a reminder of how fragile their lives truly were. It was late that evening when Emily decided to leave the library. She liked to linger there after school, her head buried in novels that transported her far from the monotony of Ashfield. Her backpack thumped against her back as she walked through the quiet streets, the warmth of the summer day giving way to a chilling breeze. When a police car rolled to a stop beside her, she glanced nervously toward the glowing headlights. Officer Paul Whitman leaned out of the open window, his smile sharp against the darkened backdrop of his cruiser. "Emily," he called, his tone too friendly, too casual. "It's late. Let me give you a ride home." Emily hesitated. Everyone in Ashfield knew Officer Whitman. His patrols often brought him to school events or town gatherings, where he'd chat with parents, charm the elderly, and offer candy to children. He seemed to relish the attention, the small gestures of respect his badge afforded him. But there had always been something about him, a lingering gaze, the way he held eye contact for just a beat too long, that made Emily uneasy. "I'm fine walking," she stammered, clutching the straps of her backpack. "It's no trouble," Whitman replied, his voice soft, but insistent. He reached over and pushed open the passenger door. "Hop in." Reluctantly, Emily climbed into the car. The short ride to her house felt stifling. Whitman asked her about school, her hobbies, her life at home. His tone was light, but his eyes flicked to her in the rearview mirror with unsettling frequency. She hugged her backpack closer, muttering terse replies, willing the ride to end. As they approached her street, Whitman suddenly veered off course, pulling the cruiser into a secluded lot behind the old high school gymnasium. Emily froze. "Where are we going?" Her voice cracked, panic seeping in. Whitman smiled again, but the warmth had drained from it. "Just thought we'd chat for a bit. Don't look so scared, Emily." The air inside the car grew suffocating as he killed the engine. She reached for the door handle, but he moved faster, his hand clamping down on her wrist. "Relax," he murmured, his voice now low and menacing. "You're safe with me." What happened next would haunt Emily forever. His grip tightened as he dragged her from the car, her cries for help swallowed by the heavy silence of the night. The lot was deserted, a patch of asphalt surrounded by tall trees that seemed to block out the world. Whitman forced her to the ground, his weight crushing her resistance as she clawed at him, desperate to escape. "Stop fighting," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "This'll be easier if you just..." She screamed, kicking wildly, but his hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. The pain was sharp, searing, and all-consuming. When it was over, she lay motionless, her body trembling with shock and fear. Whitman straightened his uniform, his voice calm as though nothing had happened. "You'll be fine, Emily," he said, tossing her backpack at her feet. "Let's not make this complicated, okay?" Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. Her voice had fled, buried under the weight of her terror. When Emily stumbled home later that night, her face pale and her steps unsteady, Ruth was waiting. "Emily?" Ruth called from the kitchen, concern creasing her brow. "Where were you?" "I was worried sick." Emily didn't answer. She moved past her mother, her gaze fixed on the floor, and locked herself in her room. Ruth knocked on the door for what felt like hours, her worry growing with each unanswered plea. Inside, Emily curled into a corner of her bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Tears streamed silently down her face as the night replayed in jagged fragments. The ride. The lot. The sound of Whitman's voice. She didn't sleep, and by morning, the vibrant, book-loving girl Ruth had known was gone. Emily didn't speak for days after the attack. Ruth noticed the subtle changes first, the way her daughter flinched at sudden noises, how she avoided leaving the house, her silence heavy as stone. It was only when Ruth pressed Emily with a gentle but firm demand, "What happened to you?" that the dam broke. Between gasping sobs, Emily told her mother everything. The morning after Emily's confession, Ruth sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a lukewarm mug of coffee. The world felt as though it had shifted on its axis. Her daughter, her bright, sensitive Emily, had been violated, and the weight of it pressed against Ruth's chest like an iron bar. The man Emily described, the same Officer Whitman who patrolled their streets and waved at Ruth each morning, suddenly felt like a lurking predator. Ruth's grief gave way to fury. She couldn't let this stand. Ashfield's justice system had to be held accountable. Ruth drove Emily to the police station that afternoon. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. Ruth tried to reassure her, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Don't worry, honey," Ruth said, trying to mask her own doubt. "We'll get through this. He won't get away with it." But the station, with its sterile walls and bustling officers, only deepened Emily's unease. The sight of police uniforms made her chest tighten, her breath quicken. Whitman wasn't there, but his specter lingered in the uniforms, in the authoritative voices barking orders. Detective Hannah Collins met them in a small, windowless office. Collins, a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for integrity, listened carefully as Ruth recounted Emily's ordeal. Emily sat silently, her hands twisting in her lap, unable to meet Collins's gaze. "Emily," Collins said gently, leaning forward. "I need to hear it from you. I know this is hard, but we can't take action unless you tell me everything." Emily's voice trembled as she recounted the attack. Collins nodded solemnly, her pen scratching across her notepad. Ruth kept a steady hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering silent support as Emily's words faltered, her breath hitching with suppressed sobs. When Emily finished, Collins closed her notebook. "We'll take this seriously, Ruth." "Emily. I'll start an investigation immediately." As they left, Ruth felt a flicker of hope. Collins seemed like someone who wouldn't let this be swept under the rug. But as the days turned into weeks, cracks began to show. Whitman's reputation shielded him like armor. Within hours of the complaint, rumors spread like wildfire through Ashfield. Ruth overheard snippets at the diner, hushed voices questioning Emily's story, others insisting that Whitman wasn't capable of something like that. "You know how girls can be," one customer murmured over his coffee. "Making things up for attention." It made Ruth's blood boil. Emily had retreated further into herself, her silence a prison she couldn't escape. She spent her days curled up in her room, refusing to eat or speak. Ruth begged her to see a therapist, but Emily's only response was a shake of her head. The investigation progressed haltingly. Collins interviewed Whitman, who, as expected, denied everything. "I gave her a ride home," he admitted, his voice calm. "That's it. I thought I was doing the right thing." He spun a narrative laced with just enough plausible deniability to muddy the waters. "She seemed upset," he said during his interview. "I thought she might have been having trouble at home. Maybe she misinterpreted my kindness." But there were cracks in his story. Collins knew it. She noted the inconsistencies, his reluctance to explain why he deviated from the direct route to Emily's house, his inability to account for the time spent in the lot behind the school. Still, the lack of witnesses and physical evidence hampered the case. Then there were the signs of Whitman's attention toward Emily, clues that in hindsight made Ruth's stomach churn. Collins spoke to Emily's friends and teachers, piecing together a pattern of behavior. Whitman had been present at nearly every school event, his patrol car parked conspicuously near the entrance. Teachers recalled how he would linger in the hallway during class changes, his eyes following Emily more often than they should have. A librarian mentioned that he'd once stopped by the library and made casual conversation with Emily, offering her a ride home when she declined. "He's been grooming her," Ruth whispered to Collins when these details came to light. "It's not just an attack, it's calculated." Collins agreed, but proving intent in court was another matter entirely. Ruth's confidence in the system began to falter. Too many officers, too many townsfolk, were reluctant to tarnish Whitman's name. And when Collins requested his patrol car's GPS records, the department hesitated. "It's standard procedure," they claimed. "We'll get to it." Weeks turned into a month, and Emily's condition worsened. Ruth found her daughter crying silently in her room one evening, her pillow soaked with tears. "Sweetheart," Ruth murmured, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We'll get him. I promise. Just, hold on a little longer." But Emily didn't respond. Her once vivid eyes stared blankly at the wall, her voice locked away. One afternoon, Collins called Ruth into her office. The expression on her face was grim. "Ruth, I need you to prepare yourself," she began. "Whitman's well-connected. He's retained a high-profile lawyer, and the department isn't as cooperative as I'd hoped. I've subpoenaed his GPS records, but, let's just say it's going to be a battle." Ruth clenched her fists, her fury threatening to boil over. "What about justice, detective? What about my daughter?" Collins hesitated. "I believe Emily. I'll fight for her. But you need to understand, it's not always about what's true. It's about what we can prove." Ruth left the station feeling hollow. The system wasn't built for girls like Emily. It was built to protect men like Whitman. As she climbed into her car, she gripped the steering wheel tightly. The image of Whitman's smug face haunted her. If the system wouldn't deliver justice, Ruth thought, then maybe justice would have to come another way. The courtroom was a cathedral of rules and rituals, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced judges long past. Ruth sat in the front row, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. On her left, Emily stared blankly ahead, her once expressive eyes dulled to a lifeless gray. The trial of Officer Paul Whitman had begun. Whitman entered the courtroom with his lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit who exuded confidence. Ruth hated him on sight. They took their seats, Whitman's demeanor calm, even smug. He caught Ruth's glare and offered her a faint, knowing smile that turned her stomach. Detective Collins had fought tooth and nail to bring the case this far. Her investigation, though thorough, had faced roadblock after roadblock. The GPS records finally arrived, but they had conveniently omitted the timeframe of the attack. Requests for additional data were delayed with bureaucratic excuses. Still, Collins had managed to build a case. Witnesses testified about Whitman's pattern of behavior, including the librarian who recounted his unwelcome presence at the school. Ruth watched each one take the stand with a mix of gratitude and dread. Their words were powerful, but would they be enough? Then Emily took the stand. She sat in the witness chair, clutching the armrests like they might anchor her against the tide of memories threatening to drown her. The prosecutor, a kind but methodical woman named Ms. Graves, approached gently. "Emily," Graves began, her voice soft. "Can you tell the court about the evening of July 10th? Emily hesitated. Her eyes darted toward Whitman, who sat motionless at the defense table. His presence loomed like a storm cloud. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. He offered me a ride home," she began. "I didn't want to get in the car, but I did." As she spoke, the courtroom grew quieter, her words drawing everyone into the darkness of that night. She described the detour, the secluded lot, the way Whitman's voice turned cold and commanding. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she recounted his attack, her voice breaking when she said, "I begged him to stop." Ruth clenched her fists, her heart shattering anew with each word. When Emily finished, Graves offered her a small nod. "Thank you, Emily. That was very brave." But Whitman's lawyer was ready. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone almost patronizing. "You said you got into Officer Whitman's car voluntarily. Is that correct?" Emily nodded weakly. "So, he didn't force you into the vehicle?" "No," she admitted, her voice trembling. The lawyer paced the courtroom, his footsteps deliberate. "And you didn't scream for help when you were in the parking lot, did you?" I couldn't," Emily stammered. "I was too scared." He pounced on her hesitation. "But you didn't scream. Isn't it possible that you misunderstood Officer Whitman's actions? That he was simply trying to help you?" Emily looked down, her silence speaking volumes. Ruth wanted to leap to her daughter's defense, to scream the truth until the walls cracked, but she stayed rooted in place, powerless to intervene. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day a fresh wound. Whitman's defense painted him as a model officer, a pillar of the community who had been unfairly targeted. They leaned heavily on the lack of physical evidence, the absence of witnesses, and Emily's hesitant demeanor. They even attacked Ruth. A character witness for Whitman suggested that Ruth's single mother status made her prone to overreacting, and that she had poisoned Emily's account. Ruth's jaw tightened, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, Ruth clung to a fragile thread of hope. Detective Collins assured her they'd presented a strong case, but Ruth could see the doubt in her eyes. Whitman's connections ran deep, his charm and charisma enough to sway even the most skeptical. The verdict came 2 days later. The courtroom was packed as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Ruth held Emily's hand, her own trembling as she braced for what was to come. "Not guilty." The words rang out like a death knell. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a murmured buzz. Whitman's lawyer clapped him on the back, and Whitman stood, turning to face the gallery. His smug smile was back, sharper than ever. He met Ruth's gaze, his expression triumphant. Ruth gripped Emily's hand tighter as her daughter collapsed into silent tears. Fury bubbled within her, her vision narrowing until all she could see was Whitman's face. That evening, Ashfield streets were quieter than usual. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, staring at the gun her husband had left behind when he went off to war. She had kept it locked away, a relic of a life she no longer wanted to remember. Now, it lay before her, heavy with possibility. Emily was asleep in her room, exhausted by the day's events. Ruth couldn't bear to disturb her. She thought of Whitman's smile, the jury's verdict, the whispers in the diner that would inevitably start again. They didn't believe her. They didn't believe Emily. The system had failed them. But Ruth wouldn't. She wrapped her fingers around the gun, its cold metal a strange comfort. Her hands no longer trembled. She didn't feel fear or doubt, only a calm, steely resolve. If the system wouldn't protect her daughter, Ruth would find justice on her own terms. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty, bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. Paul Whitman strode to his car, his movements confident, his posture relaxed. He had spent the last hour celebrating with his lawyer, laughing over drinks about how justice prevailed. He reached his vehicle and unlocked the door, but something made him pause, a subtle shift in the air, a prickle at the back of his neck. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the lot. It was empty. Satisfied, he slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. But as he reached for the gear shift, he caught movement in the side mirror, a figure emerging from the shadows. Whitman barely had time to turn his head before the passenger door swung open, and Ruth Carter climbed into the seat beside him. She held her husband's old revolver, its barrel trembling slightly as she aimed it at Whitman's chest. Her eyes burned with a fury he hadn't anticipated, her face a mask of resolve. "Drive," she said. Whitman stared at her, his hands frozen on the wheel. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone carefully measured. "You don't want to do this." "Drive," she repeated, her voice cold, unwavering. He hesitated, but the look in her eyes made it clear she wasn't bluffing. Slowly, he shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the lot. The drive was silent, the tension in the car so thick it felt suffocating. Ruth directed him down the darkened streets of Ashfield, away from the town center and into the woods on its outskirts. Whitman tried to speak, his voice calm and measured. "I know you're upset," he said. "But this isn't the way to fix things. Think of Emily." Ruth's grip on the gun tightened. "Don't you dare say her name." Whitman exhaled sharply, his patience slipping. "You're angry, I get that. But killing me? That's not going to help her. It's only going to ruin your life." "My life is already ruined," Ruth snapped. "You ruined it the moment you touched my daughter. You ruined hers." He opened his mouth to argue, but Ruth cut him off. "Take the next left." The road narrowed, the forest growing thicker as they went. Whitman's palms were slick on the wheel, his composure cracking. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice strained. "You'll see." The clearing came into view, a desolate patch of earth surrounded by towering pines. Ruth ordered him to stop the car. The engine idled as she gestured for him to step out. "Out," she commanded. Whitman obeyed, his movements slow and deliberate. Ruth followed, the gun never wavering. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ruth's voice cracked as she spoke, the pain and rage of the past weeks spilling out. "Do you even care about the lives you've destroyed?" Whitman raised his hands, his expression morphing into something that resembled sympathy. "Mrs. Carter, I..." "Shut up," she screamed, the sound echoing through the trees. "You don't get to talk. Not after what you've done." He took a cautious step toward her. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Maybe there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Ruth's laugh was bitter, sharp. "You assaulted my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Whitman flinched but recovered quickly. "That's not true," he said, his tone pleading. "You have to believe me." Ruth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You've been lying your whole life, haven't you? Smiling, shaking hands, acting like the hero while you preyed on girls like Emily." Whitman took another step forward. "Put the gun down, Ruth. You don't want to do this. If you pull that trigger, you'll lose everything." Ruth steadied her aim. "I already have." The silence that followed was deafening. Whitman took one last step, his hand outstretched as if he could reason with her. But Ruth didn't flinch. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot rang out, splitting the night like a thunderclap. Whitman staggered backward, clutching his chest as blood bloomed across his shirt. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock. "Please," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Don't." The second shot cut him off. Then the third. When it was over, Ruth stood motionless, the gun still raised. Whitman lay sprawled on the ground, his body eerily still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the trees themselves were witnesses to what had just transpired. Ruth lowered the gun, her hands shaking as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. She stared at Whitman's lifeless body, her mind blank. For weeks, she had dreamed of this moment, imagined what it would feel like to take justice into her own hands. But now that it was done, she felt nothing. No relief. No closure. Only an aching void. She turned back to the car, her steps slow and heavy. The gun fell from her hand, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. As she climbed into the driver's seat, she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, haunted, broken, but resolute. Ruth started the car and drove away, leaving the clearing and its grim secret behind. Ruth Carter knew the consequences were inevitable. As she pulled into her driveway in the gray dawn hours, she felt the weight of what she'd done settle into her bones. She didn't bother hiding the gun. She didn't clean her clothes. She simply sat at the kitchen table and waited. The police arrived within an hour. Detective Hannah Collins, her face pale and unreadable, stepped into the house with two uniformed officers trailing her. "Ruth," Collins said softly. "We need to take you in." Ruth nodded, her hands already extended for the cuffs. Emily, woken by the commotion, stood at the top of the stairs, her face ashen. "Mom." Her voice cracked. Ruth looked up at her daughter, offering a faint, sad smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. Stay strong." Emily didn't move, didn't respond, as the officers led her mother away. The trial for Ruth Carter began with a media frenzy that engulfed the quiet streets of Ashfield. The story of a grieving mother who took justice into her own hands was polarizing. Some called her a murderer, others, a hero. But for Ruth, the labels didn't matter. All that mattered was Emily. As Ruth sat in her cell awaiting the trial, Emily's condition deteriorated. The girl who had already lost her voice now seemed to lose herself entirely. She stopped eating, stopped attending school, and spent most days curled in her bed, staring at the wall. Visits to see her mother in prison were brief and strained, Emily's silence screaming louder than any words. Detective Collins, despite her personal feelings about Ruth's actions, couldn't let go of the nagging sense that something about Whitman's trial had been off. Her instincts pushed her to dig deeper, starting with the connections between Whitman and Judge Carlton Banks, the man who had presided over the case. Collins's research revealed a long history between the two men. They had grown up together in Ashfield, played football together in high school, and even attended the same law enforcement training academy before Banks switched careers to pursue law. Collins requested court records, and what she found made her stomach churn. During Whitman's trial, Banks had made several questionable rulings, excluding GPS data that placed Whitman's car in the school parking lot, disallowing testimony from a teacher who claimed Whitman had harassed other students, and overruling objections that should have been upheld. It was becoming clear that the verdict had been steered. The final piece of evidence came when Collins uncovered a series of encrypted text messages between Whitman and Banks. They detailed a plan to ensure Whitman's acquittal, with Banks assuring his friend that, "the court will take care of you." As Collins's investigation gained traction, more damning evidence against Whitman came to light. A forensic re-examination of his patrol car revealed fibers from Emily's backpack embedded in the seat cushions, fibers overlooked in the initial investigation. An IT specialist recovered deleted messages from Whitman's phone, including one to a fellow officer, "They're looking at me too closely. If it goes south, you'll back me up, right?" By the time Ruth's trial began, the courtroom buzzed with whispers about the unraveling corruption. The prosecution painted Ruth as a cold-blooded vigilante, but her defense team fought back fiercely. They highlighted the failure of the justice system, the judge's bias, and the overwhelming evidence now coming to light. The defense called Collins to the stand, and her testimony shifted the tide. She presented the texts between Whitman and Banks, the suppressed fibers, and the deleted messages, all proof that Whitman had been guilty and that Banks had orchestrated his acquittal. "This wasn't justice," Collins said, her voice steady and clear. "This was a betrayal of everything the system is supposed to stand for." Emily's struggles weighed heavily on the court's proceedings. A psychologist testified about her worsening emotional state, describing the girl as clinically withdrawn, deeply traumatized, and likely to remain so without her mother's support. When Emily herself was called to testify, the courtroom held its breath. She walked slowly to the stand, her movements stiff and robotic. For a moment, she sat in silence, staring at her hands. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My mom, she did what she had to. He hurt me, and no one cared." Her words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. The trial concluded with the jury deliberating for days. The media speculated wildly, pundits arguing over whether Ruth's actions were justified or criminal. When the verdict was finally read, Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Ruth sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face. Emily, seated in the gallery, stood and rushed into her mother's arms. It was the first time Ruth had seen her daughter smile in months. In the weeks that followed, Judge Banks faced charges of judicial misconduct and conspiracy, his career and reputation in ruins. A broader investigation uncovered systemic corruption in the Ashfield Police Department, leading to multiple resignations and firings. Detective Collins, hailed as a hero for her relentless pursuit of justice, was promoted to captain. As for Ruth and Emily, their road to recovery was slow but steady. Ruth found work at a nearby women's advocacy center, channeling her pain into helping others. Emily began therapy, her voice gradually returning as the weight of her trauma lifted. They often visited the clearing where Ruth had confronted Whitman, not to dwell on the violence, but to remind themselves of what they had overcome. The shadows of Ashfield lingered, but for the first time in months, mother and daughter felt the warmth of the sun breaking through.